we'll just, yeah, we'll segue just to this, to the three of you, and then we'll, yeah, but there will be the first one.
Test 1, 2.
Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to session 2, and good morning also to our online delegates. My name is Philip Spotswood from the Department for Communities, and I'm delighted to be facilitating this session. The session is titled Working from the Outside, Advancing Governmental Action Through Planning, Advocacy and Support. The session falls within the wider conference theme of How Can Government Get It Right? It will be delivered by an esteemed panel of 5 experts from both the US and the UK. Each panellist brings a unique perspective, expertise and research-based knowledge, and we're delighted to have with us Dr. Wendy Parent-Johnston from the University of Arizona, Fazli Hadi from Disability Rights UK, Dr. Derek Nord from Indiana University, Dr. Kristen Hamry from Indiana University also, and joining us through Zoom is Liz Sayce from the London School of Economics. Before I begin, hand over, just run through a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, if everyone could please mute their mobile phone. Bathrooms on this floor. If you go out of the door, turn left, down past the escalators. The toilets are on your left-hand side. In the unlikely event of an emergency situation occurring, please follow instructions from the venue staff, who will direct you to the nearest exit and safe assembly point. Please also follow any instructions given over the PA system. For wheelchair users, venue staff will direct you to the nearest fire evacuation lift, and another member of venue staff will be there to accompany you in the lift and out to the nearest safe assembly point. On each level there are 2 refuge points, one on each end of the corridor, along with evacuation chairs, and venue staff are trained in the use of those in case of emergency. I now hand over to the panel to deliver the session, Working from the Outside, Advancing Governmental Action Through Planning, Advocacy and Support.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm going to just give a quick introduction of this topic, but I think before I do so, I think our circumstances warrant maybe just a little explanation. COVID is still happening, and it's still affecting people, and we have the fortune of being here, all of us, the entire panel. Unfortunately, somebody is right now sequestered in her hotel room, Dr. Liz Sayce. She'll be joining us by way of Zoom, but as you've all experienced over the last 2 going on 3 years, technology has a way of giving us a curveball, if you will. So Liz cannot hear us. But we're gonna problem solve that by providing her some time here to speak, and then we'll patch her out of here, and we'll continue on with the full panel as planned. So just bear with us as we literally make this up as we go. But isn't that the motto from the last 2 years? We can make it up. So anyway, thanks for having us, and thanks for the panel that's joining us today. You know, many of us, probably in this room, I know this entire panel works in government in some fashion. Now, all of us, at least on the panel, work outside of government, working to affect government in various ways, as are the previous panel here, focusing on the employment side, or the employer side of the employment challenge that we all face. Government also plays a big role, as we know. They are where we're from. They serve as regulators of workplaces, goal setters and for economies, but they also serve as places of critical services and supports for people with disabilities. So there's a lot of different perspectives that governments that we seek to change. Of course, they're also one of the biggest employers. If you go to any country, they're usually one of the bigger employers in countries. So they kind of straddle all of these spaces that really require diverse strategies to affect. And what we have here in the panel is really an attempt to bring some diverse perspectives on how we can touch and influence those different kind of areas, both as an employer, as systems of support, as overseers of employers in the community. So the idea here is to bring that kind of diverse perspective, but then also to hear ideally from all of you. We have expertise up here, but I know many of you have expertise that I think this entire summit would benefit from. So we will at some point here have some roving microphones. We'd love to hear any questions and comments you have, but also we want to engage you because we are first to admit we do not know it all. And none of us in this room know it all, but I think collectively we have a great deal of expertise, and we would really like to engage and hear from you on your perspectives. So I'm going to cue right now our IT person back there. Liz is going to say some comments, and then she's going to step out. So hopefully this works. If not, we'll problem solve. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and we're back. Okay, that didn't work. We tried, we failed, but we will move on. Now I'm shifting gears here. So, first to set the stage on this panel, again, I want to get to, I really want to help this group audience understand some of the diverse perspectives at the table. So rather than me diving into those, I'm going to hand it off to each of them to go around and just share a little bit about their work in this space of employment and working with government and kind of the vantage point that you're bringing to this conversation. That would be helpful.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Parent-Johnson, and I'm the director of the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities at the University of Arizona. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that state, we're located right on the border of Mexico, so we have some very diverse communities. It's very rural, and we also have 22 Native American nations that are sovereign. and so they're independent government-run communities. And so there's very diverse perspectives and strategies for implementing employment. And what we found is that, you know, people want to do the right thing. There's lots of good things in each community, but there's always something missing. And trying to figure out how to implement that and bring those things together has been one of the biggest challenges, and where we have found is the most effective way to impact policy and decision making that drives a greater level of change across the state. So looking at local communities and creating, implementing, starting small and making things happen so that people can see what we're talking about, so they can see the successes, so we can collect data, and more importantly, share stories that show the journey that people took to become employed, not just what the outcome was, but how they got there. And we found this to be extremely valuable in working together. And those local communities that are so different have some similarities, and including some of the decision makers in those communities as we are working to implement those. So by driving policy at the local level and still working at the state level and the national levels, we found that to be really helpful to do those things simultaneously. One of the focuses that we have is to model development, look at new ways to do things, and then helping those communities to build capacity, and then using that information to be able to drive change at the systems level and at the policy level through government. And so by doing all of these things at the same time, we have found really great results in being able to make change and at the same time improve employment outcomes.
Yeah, and you know, maybe let's pass it off to Fazila here.
Great, thank you. That was really fascinating, Wendy, because I'm going to talk about a very different example of influence and change. So, hello everyone, I'm Fazila Hardy. I'm Head of Policy at Disability Rights UK, which is a disabled people's-led organisation, which means that the majority of our trustees and our staff are disabled people. We support the social model of disability, so when we use the phrase disabled people, we're not describing people's impairments or health conditions, we're describing the disabling barriers that we face. And we're very much linked to other disabled people's-led organisations across England and the UK. So just a bit about myself. I began to lose my sight when I was about 9, and looking back now, I just feel incredibly lucky and privileged that it did work out for me, that I was able to get through exams with the right support and adjustments, that I was able to have a support worker to work with me in the workplace, and that the right equipment, and especially when computers began to talk to me, that kind of changed my life pretty much. And so I feel, I'd echo the comments made earlier today that actually working, if you are able to work, and I know not all disabled people can work, but if you are able to work and you want to work, it brings economic independence, it does bring social connection, and it certainly has given me a lot of purpose. So I think, you know, I'd really like us to have those disabled people in the room with us as we sort of think about these examples of influence and change. Just to explain a bit about the UK context, we think the employment gap, as we call it, disability employment gap, is 30 percentage points. So around 82% of non-disabled people are working age are in work, and around 52% of disabled people. That masks some really bad statistics for some impairment groups. So if you've got a learning disability, if you're totally blind, if you've got autism, you're going to have a much, much worse rate than that. Maybe 6% for learning disabilities, 17% for autism, 10% if you're completely blind. So that employment gap of 30% does mask much worse statistics. The government's recently announced, and I'm sure Minister Chloe Smith will talk about this, that they've achieved 1 million more disabled people in work since 2017. But what they don't say is that actually the prevalence of disability in the workforce has gone up. So the employment gap hasn't closed. It's just that as the workforce ages, surprise, surprise, more disabled people are in it. And I'm really pleased about that because I think that will have its own cultural change eventually. And I'm really pleased if people who become disabled while they're at work manage to retain their jobs. But nevertheless, that 30% gap has been very persistent. So I just want to talk to you about something we've done recently with other allies to try and convince government to close that gap. During COVID, a big trade union called Unison, which is a public sector union, and Disability Rights UK, we held a kind of online webinar. They were very popular once, weren't they? Loads of people came, and we talked about how the pandemic was disproportionately impacting disabled people. But we wanted to do more than that, and we thought that if we could just distill some of the things government needed to do into a disability employment charter and speak much more powerfully with one voice, maybe we would find it easier to be heard. So Unison, Disability Rights UK, other disability charities, academics who work in the space of disability, all signed up and developed this charter. And we launched it last October, and there's some copies around the room. And basically, it does simplify the world, but actually for decision makers, you do often have to simplify the world. And it basically asks government to do 9 things. Some of them, all of them just pretty simple and almost stating the obvious. But I think the reason for mentioning it is that I think unifying what we want government to do, unifying our messages as disabled people with allies is really, really important. And if we all stay fragmented, all speaking up for our own impairment and health condition groups, all focusing on slightly different things that would close the gap, unfortunately that leaves government lots of wriggle room. So we're really hopeful that having a coherent agenda of 9 things we want them to do will help us when we try and influence Minister Chloe Smith and others in government. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Kristen Hamry.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kristen Hamry from Indiana University in the United States. I saw Dr. Jones has joined us and invited you all to Iowa this morning, so I'll say there's another stop off in the Midwest in Indiana as well. So I work in the space of research. Of course, I'm a professor there, and I work around concepts like self-determination and decisional supports and decision-making across the lifespan. And I'm, like I hope most researchers are, one of those researchers who does not want to see my work collect dust on the shelf, as they say. And so I try to find ways to translate that work into being useful, and so I partner a lot with government agencies to try to create change. I loved hearing Senator Harkin talk this morning about the illusion of disability. And I think a lot of what I confront in my work and look at and think about is confronting like the illusion of independence. And I like that word. I'm not opposed to using that word, but I think it's so important that we recontextualize really what that means, because I think nobody's really independent, right? We're all really interdependent. Like, for example, I would not have gotten here this morning without Google Maps to help me lead the way. And I did a fairly poor job at it, but it would tell me to take a new route. So I appreciated hearing from the business people in the room, because I think there are who were in the session before and sort of talked about the multitude of ways and things being done in terms of innovation to help people be more independent, right? And then I also loved hearing Charlotte McLean-Nadapo talk about the importance of choice making and how critical that is. And I loved hearing her talk about that from like the young school age up, because I do think that's where things start. Unfortunately, we see almost in the data, the child is born or acquires the disability, and from there on out, the trajectory is set, right? It's almost like in the data you could predict what's going to happen, and that just shouldn't be the case. We need to have open opportunities for every person. And so in the United States context, we see this concept of full guardianship. I think it has many different names in many different countries, but essentially it's about the ability to make your own choices, right? And if you're a person who's under full guardianship, you don't have the ability to make any of your choices, including what you're going to eat for breakfast, who you might live with, and of course that extends to whether or not you have a job. And in the data we see in a lot of cases that people who are under guardianship, probably this doesn't surprise you, don't have access to employment. And when we see that they have the opportunity and regain, in some cases, their ability to make choices, of course, among the first things they want to do is to get a job, right? It's like has been spoken about so much today in the past day or so, is how important that is for your identity, right? And so that is where a lot of my work lies, and just talking about sports. I don't want to go on because I know.
No, that's okay. Thank you, and I'll go from here. So what you hear here, I hope, are these various perspectives and really angles that our work can really, our fingers can get into working and supporting government. Now, I want to get to maybe some more specifics here from each of you. But Wendy, you talked about your engagement in local communities in the grassroots. Can you just describe how you've worked to engage those communities to really push some of those changes? What are some of the strategies you use? How have you put pressure or partnered with government in these communities? Thank you.
Thank you. You know, what I think is at the heart of everything is relationships, and we talk about that a lot, but I mean relationships where we really build that partnership together. We get to know each other, we understand their perspectives, and the way that I find to do that best is to spend time together. We all come with a different lens, a different set of experiences, and by just going and spending time together and listening without an agenda, I think that is one of the most difficult things for us to get used to, because we go in and we've got to have a meeting, we've got to have a time, we've got to have a purpose. And so it feels like we're not doing anything to just go spend time together. But I have found that to be at the heart of making change and engaging those communities. So spending time, having a champion at the local level to work together with that can kind of bring the other people to the table, and then problem solving together, so that you're going to run into challenges when people are struggling with implementation. Whether you have good policy or you're trying to change that policy, there are struggles to implement. Things don't always trickle down no matter what country we're in. And so helping people to see what can we do to solve this one stumbling block that's in the way for us to move forward. And by coming in and bringing some extra resources and blending and braiding all of the resources everyone has together, that really can help just enhance the opportunities that you can create, and much more so than what any one entity can do on their own. And so allowing everybody to bring those together and make it happen, and like I say, really small. It's okay to start with one or two people. We don't have to change everything all at once, but just a few helps us get started and work our way through. And I think one other tidbit of information is that it's an organic process that takes time. We heard that in the other session from the employer perspective. It takes some time, but I don't think we have to wait for all those changes to start making change occur at the local level. And so letting it grow organically, and again, not having that agenda, but having the common goal that we all want to achieve employment, but letting it grow organically and realizing that the way to get to that end is not just a straight line. It goes back and forth, and there's setbacks and movement forward, but eventually you get there. And that's where the data can help contribute to that policy change that most government entities, agencies, anyone that is a decision maker needs to have something concrete to work with. And so if we can't implement to demonstrate what it is we want them to change, then there's some struggles. And the last piece that I just want to mention is that even at that level, then there's assistance needed. So while we're working at the local level, we also need to provide technical assistance and support to those agencies or governments that are trying to make the change as well. They have a lot more bureaucracy that impacts their decision making and helping to navigate through some of those to make changes occur. These have all been really helpful. And just to give an idea, the Tohono O'odham Nation that is on the border with Arizona and into Mexico. It crosses two countries. It's a sovereign Native American nation. We have been implementing this there as a great example to illustrate what I've been talking about, and the state agency has been a part of that, and the policies are changing. Now, as a result of that and the successes that we're seeing there, the Navajo Nation, which crosses over multiple states in the United States and the largest Native American sovereign nation, is also, we're working now to replicate and do the same types of things that we're doing there, implementing these strategies, not just in the Native American communities, but others around the state as well. We've seen these strategies very effectively work at that local level in all these different diverse communities.
Thank you, Wendy.
Yes.
And now, Vasile, just to add to this kind of conversation, your work on the charter that you mentioned, can you share some of the challenges? You brought many communities together to somehow join to identify priorities. That's no easy task. How? I bet. Yeah. Can you share a little about your experience?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because on one level, yes, everyone wants slightly different things, but you can try and distill it. I do sometimes think we overcomplicate everything, don't we? And we can't give government. I mean, as Wendy says, government wants evidence, but it also wants some clear recommendations. It doesn't want shopping lists of 30, 40, 50 things it should do. And that's why we thought it was really important to distill. And yeah, maybe we have left some stuff out, but do you know what? It doesn't matter, because this charter, it opens the conversation. So to give some of you just some examples of what's in it. So we call for better government monitoring of disability in the workforce. So we call for what's called mandatory disability workforce monitoring. So that's about visibility. We call for improvements to the access to work scheme and reasonable adjustments for disabled employees. So that's about supporting people in the workplace. We talk about better support for employment programs, helping disabled people get into work. None of this is rocket science, but actually to put it in, to distill it and then to use it. So we've already used it to influence some consultations that government has brought out, one on flexible working, one on workforce monitoring. We're going to, I'm sure, use it to influence the National Disability Strategy. So it gives us something to kind of sort of symbolises the change we want to see. And as I say, maybe we haven't got it perfect. I think the other thing it does is it really helps big employers to see maybe what they could be doing, not waiting for government. And I don't know about your countries at the moment, but in the UK I sometimes feel that there's probably more kind of leeway to make progress with employers and big corporate sectors than there is maybe with government. We have a government that isn't that keen on investing in public services and isn't even that keen on equality, not in its kind of pronouncements, although we do have the National Disability Strategy. But we see some of the big employers, and I've mentioned the NHS in England, the National Health Service, it employs 1.2 million people. It does have a workforce disability equality standard. It does monitor how many disabled people in the workforce. It does monitor whether we experience more harassment, more bullying, whether we're in senior level roles. So sometimes you can go to the NHS, you can go to some of the big banks and other corporates and actually see amazing practice, see disability staff networks, see employers and businesses trying to change the dial. So I think that also has an impact on government because they can't use business as an excuse not to do things. And then finally, just make the point that, we do need some unity amongst disabled people ourselves because, if we all compete for our own impairment group, that becomes very tricky. Now, I know that we all need different solutions, so I need particular solutions as a blind employee, and that'll be different if I had a learning disability or if I was deaf or I had a mental health issue. But actually, we all need the barriers removing, so I think there's more that we have in common than we have that separates us. So I think we too could get a lot better in unifying our calls for change. But yeah, the Charter gives us that opportunity to go, do you know what? This is what we want. I can't remember the phrase from this morning, but are you fired up? And yeah, we're ready. That kind of thing. You know what? Get on with it.
Thanks. And Kristen, I'm going to change it up just a little bit more because you come at this work from a different vantage point from this area of guardianship and decision making. And in the United States, that's to take away someone's autonomy and ability to make their own decisions. And I mean legally take it away. It requires a different branch of government than I think disability space we tend to operate. We tend to operate what I call as the usual suspects. We operate in health and human service type government. We maybe are operating in the employment space, but you're working and informing the judicial space to some extent to change policy around and laws around how maybe making it more challenging to take away those rights. In Indiana, it's very easy if you have, say, an intellectual disability to take away one's rights. But can you just speak to the importance of bringing in other government sectors, if you will, that I think are oftentimes outside of the typical employment space?
Sure, and I'm going to do what a lot of the best politicians I've seen do, which is hear your question, but then answer the question I want.
That's okay.
I'm just kidding. But I think what you're talking about really intersects with what I was planning to kind of respond to in conjunction with my two friends to my right, which is this idea around creating partnerships to create change. I have a tricky and sticky relationship with the whole concept of let's understand that this is going to take time and let's have patience, because how much longer do people have to wait? Right? How patient do historically marginalized groups have to be to keep asking for the same basic rights as everyone else? So I find myself always bristling when I'm hearing we've got to have patience. And I think there is patience in the process of building relationships and whatnot, and there's no way to cut corners there. But I think that there are ways to speed that up that I've seen be really effective, and one of them is to stop just talking to each other, right? And find those entities and those groups that share your values and educate them and get them up to speed, because as soon as they learn what's going on, you've got additional allies with you. And I think in particular, and you brought up the judicial system, I think that's a particularly important one. There are well-placed people who know nothing about this topic in the judicial system, in the healthcare system, for example, but their value system is such that once they learn what's going on, I think you've got an immediate ally that can grow your sector and build your coalition. In the judicial system, I mean, the state of Indiana that you bring up as an example, decades, years and years, that there really hasn't been much change in the area of employment, for example. And then we started working in the judicial system and found partners there. And people were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. So we saw things like people languishing on guardianship for decades, supposed to be checked back on yearly, right? Supposed to have things in place such as skill building to move people off guardianship. And what we found when we looked at the data was people were adjudicated and never seen again. They maybe didn't even have to appear in front of a judge to have their rights taken away. And there was no skill building going on in trying to move them out of guardianship into community living placements or employment or anything like that. So making partners in the judicial system, Indiana became among the first states to pass a law that requires supported decision-making prior to having a guardianship. And so what that results in, right, is people having their rights and people being able to make decisions such as, I'm going to live where I want to live, and by the way, I'm also going to work and have a job. So that's been really an important partnership, and I think it's a really good example for how to find people who are well-placed to help make these goals advance faster.
Thanks, that's fantastic. Now I'm going to look to the audience. I believe we have 10 minutes, and we want to know, what questions do you have? How are you operating in this space? We want your perspectives added into this. So any questions? Any comments? I can stay here all day. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Yeah, please. Mike, over here.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Helen Ferguson and I work with the National Deaf Children's Society. One of the things I've found frustrating sometimes in this and in previous jobs is that people living with disabilities, carers of people living with disabilities, will be trying to tell government for years and years and years about what they need and the changes that will make a difference in their lives. But it can take a policy think tank or a high-paid consultancy firm or occasionally research to restate those things before government will listen. And I wonder if any of the panellists or anybody else in the audience has found a way to shortcut or short-circuit that process that we sometimes feel we have to go through every time.
That's a great question. And I'm going to look to the panelists.
I mean, I'll quickly reference, I think my colleagues have something to say as well, which is, you're absolutely right. That does seem to be the way. So I think, I mean, in terms of like all sorts of allyship, is all of the people who are well placed in those positions need to first and foremost go to amplifying voices from the community. In terms of the work that we've done in Indiana, it's been all about bringing together people from the community to lift their voices and to, you know, you've asked us for a state plan on making this happen. Here it is, and the voices in this plan are people with disabilities from the community. So that's what we've done.
Yeah, you know, sometimes I feel I'm just repeating the same things every year, you know, and nothing's happening. But I think there's an underlying ableism in society. You know, institutions and services weren't built with disabled people in mind. You know, if I'd been born 100 years ago, I'd have been sent to a home for blind babies. I wouldn't have gone to school. I would have been kept in a back bedroom. And I think the pandemic showed us, certainly showed us in the UK, that government, whatever the rhetoric, doesn't really get that having a disability means you should have equal rights, civil rights, human rights. And there's been amazing struggles, across the world by disabled people, which I'm really proud of. But we haven't quite got there yet. I mean, it was very, very obvious that services were put in place in the pandemic without thinking about our needs. Communications didn't happen, enabling people to understand what was going on in the format of their choice, whether that was VSL or audio or whatever. So I think we shouldn't underestimate I don't know whether to call it a culture or the underlying assumptions within society are extremely, extremely negative. You are seen, if you're a disabled person, as having a deficit. That's why so many older people who become disabled don't want to talk about disability. They want to talk about being older. That's why so many of us, like when I first began to really lose my sight, I had internalized oppression, if you like. I felt embarrassed using a white cane. It took me quite a while. So I just wouldn't underestimate the forces that need to be changed.
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right that things take forever, and I keep seeing those things cycle over and over, and that's why I get very impatient, or why I start making things happen at the local level so that I can start driving it from both sides instead of just waiting. But through my experiences, I've also found that having credibility it starts lending to people listening more and trying to get at those tables to bring the voices of the people that are experiencing it at that local level. So people with disabilities, direct service workers, and other members of those communities, trying to bring them with me to those think tanks or those larger meetings where the discussions are occurring. Actually following through with some, if something is asked or if there's a stumbling block even within those think tanks, I like to step out and try and gather that information or do that research or bring those voices to the table, whatever it is that can keep pushing things along, even at that larger group level or whatever entity is coming together to try and make those policy decisions, so that we can bring those things to them, keep pushing things along, trying to bring those additional resources, perspectives, data, whatever pieces that they need to continue, and bringing the voices of the people that are living that experience to those tables to participate in that dialogue. And many of those things have brought some credibility and more urgency to the situation and helped drive that sometimes, not always, but.
Thank you. And I'm seeing that we have about 4 minutes left. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Oh, looks like we have one on the opposite side.
As the microphone makes its way over there as well, I'll just say also, I think any opportunity you can have to systematize and require, I think is really useful, especially in resource stress systems. That helps make things happen.
And the question.
Hi, I'm Monica, and I'm from a young disabled group. I'm just wondering why government thinks they know what's best for us and make decisions when, we know what's best for us when we tell them ourselves.
Thank you.
Good question. And what's called co-production, which is working, with disabled people to understand the barriers and solve problems. It's kind of quite an old, well-known concept now, as is nothing about us without us. But I think in the end, governments are politically driven, and unfortunately, they've got the power, and sometimes you just have to work with that. And if you look back, I really agree with Kristen that who wants to be patient, for goodness sake, your life could be going as a disabled person while you're being patient for change. But on the other hand, if we look back, in the UK certainly, the Disability Discrimination Act was passed in 1995, 20 years after the Sex Discrimination and Race Discrimination Act. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was 2007. You do almost have to take a bit of a longer view. I understand the frustration, but we mustn't be downhearted, because as campaigners and people who want to change the world, you've always got to stay positive. It's really annoying, isn't it? But you've got to stay positive. And you've got to look back and think, wow, amazing things have happened. Fazile's been in work. She wouldn't have been 100 years ago. You've just got to keep thinking that even if you've got a government that isn't listening, you're setting the seeds for what will happen in the future. So at the moment, we'll have a general election in a couple of years in the UK, so we're now thinking, how do we influence the party manifestos of, the next government? And you just have to keep looking for ways and not be too despondent that they're not listening now.
Thank you, Fazile. And that
I would
seemed...
just add one other thing, which is, again, this is the U.S. context, but I also teach policy for my students, so I have a captive audience that I can pull all the time. And I often will ask them, how many of you have ever called one of your senators? How many of you have ever called one of your representatives? And would anyone like to guess how many often have? Yeah, the giggling. They're afraid, right? They're like, these are elected officials and I can't talk to them. And I think as much as you can within the government system that you're going back to your home country, engage with those people, because they are just people and they need to hear from you and they need to hear your stories and they need to hear what you're demanding. Not to say that the community hasn't been making those demands loudly for a long time, as Fazile has noted, but we just can't stop.
Yeah. Thank you. And we're going to end on that note. I think if the takeaway there being act and partner and change. So join me in thanking the panel. And have a good rest of the conference. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, folks. That's the end of the session. The discussion will be uploaded onto the app and to the website in the next few days. But thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much.
Yeah.